Okay, now we are talking about using parameters in your subs. Now, by the way, as I said, you should include the error checking function in your, hopefully, in your final project, and you should give an explain where you might use it in your final project. If you're going to use it, maybe you'll need a more elaborate error checking, or you'll want several different error checking ones. So you might write that, you might include that information as well. Okay, now we're going to parameters. So he says add 2 more text boxes to the form. And so you can use the same form. And set the name property, the first one, to this, to text first number. And next one is name property for the second text box is text second number. And add a new button to your form. And set the text property for this new button to get answer. Okay, and then the 2 text boxes will contain numbers, 1 for each box. We'll write some code to add the 2 numbers together, but in our own sub. When the button is clicked, a message box will pop up revealing the answer to the sum of the numbers in the text box. Okay, so here's what we're going to put in our new button. So we're going to define have an integer first, and a second integer, and an answer, which is also an integer. And first is going to be set, this is a function, the value. So this is going to take the text that's in here and convert it to a number. Same thing with this one. So we'll get a number here and a number here. And then now there are other ways to do this, right? You know of other ways to do this, but here they're using this function called value. And then after first and second have been assigned these 2 numbers, we're just going to add them together and assign that to answer, and then we're going to show the answer in the message box like this. And this is all as a sub. So we're creating a private sub called add numbers. Now this private sub does not take any parameters, right? It just, when we call it, it just grabs the values from the text boxes and adds them and gives a message box with the result. Okay, now you can write this sub, and that's great, but you have to call it in order for it to do anything. You can't just write it and expect it's going to do something. That's not the way it works. Like, we have the square root function, but if you don't write it in your code somewhere, it doesn't get used. And the same thing here. So he says, now add this line of code to your get answer button. So we have a button called get answer with text get answer. So add this code, call add numbers. Okay, so inside our okay, so if you put this in there, it should give you the answers that you the result of the sum of the what's in your text boxes if you put something in your text box. Okay, now he says, suppose you change what you have. So before, what you in other words, what you have currently is this stuff is not here, it's in here. This stuff is part of your sub. But he says, okay, suppose you take it out of here and put it up here. So this is, we take these and put them in your button click, and the sub doesn't have these anymore. So what's this going to do? Well, first of all, look what happens here. So what happened here? So these are underlined now. Why is that? Because they haven't been declared within the sub. Okay? So it doesn't know what these are because we took this before. It was declared up here. Wait, let me make sure I have this right. Sorry. He took, I think what, he took this and this out. Yeah. Okay? Now answer equals this, but it doesn't know what these are. So he says the reason why there are two wiggly lines under first and second is that the add numbers sub knows nothing about these two variables. We've only declared one variable inside the subroutine, and that is this one. We didn't declare anything else. To get rid of the wiggly lines, we can set up something called a parameter, or two parameters. So he says instead of having this line for the beginning of your sub, add numbers, change it to this line. So you can change it. Now this is significantly different than what we have here. So what does this do? We've talked about this before, but let's do it again. We're declaring a variable called first and also a variable called second. Both are integers, and we're doing this declaration inside the parentheses here, so it means that these are going to be, it means that this function is going to take two parameters, both of which should be integers. So if you write this add numbers, if you call this function, then you have to have the parentheses, of course, and then inside the parentheses you have to have two arguments or two values, like one number comma another number. Now he says when you press the return key after you write this here, after you write this, he says VB, or Visual Studio, changes the part in the round brackets, in these brackets, to this actually. Well, it does that if you're using 2010 Express or earlier versions. He says if you're using 2012, they don't actually write this by val out. Now we talked about what the meaning of by val is and by ref is, but we'll talk about it again here. So so then we have these two variables called first and second, and we can refer to, so the user is going to put in something in here, like a number here, like 10, and another number here, like 5. And then within our code, we refer to those numbers, the 10 and the 5, by this, by first and by second. So first we'll refer to like the 10, and second we'll refer to the 5, for example. So he says, whatever values are currently stored in these two variables will be handed to our sub. However, he says that, remember we had this before, we were calling our add numbers function like this, but this won't work anymore, right? Because we have to supply two parameters or two arguments in here. So he says actually there's a wiggly line under here if we leave it like this. If you hold your mouse over the add numbers, you might see a tip. Arguments are not specified for parameter second of private sub add numbers as integer. So second and first, and it doesn't mention first, but also first. So both parameters are missing. So it's complaining or giving us or telling us. Oh, by the way, parameters are here. These are called parameters, but when you put numbers into the function, like we're supposed to put in 5 comma 10 in here, or 10 comma 5, those are called arguments. So the arguments are the things that you actually put in when you call it, and the parameters are when you're defining it. You say first is one of the parameters and second is another parameter. But he's not going to make that distinction. He's just going to call everything parameters, but it's really not so hard. He says it's confusing, but it's not confusing. When you call the function, so you call it with the numbers 10 and 5, those are called arguments. But the parameters are these, first and second. It's not so confusing. But anyway, here he's just going to call them both parameters. Okay, anyway, in other words, you don't have to you don't have any option. If you want to call this sub, you have to add values for the parameters you set up. Right? So now you change, that's not good. Well, okay. He's going to call it like this. Instead of actually putting numbers in there, he's going to put in variables. But these variables better have some assignments. Otherwise, this won't be very good. But these do have meaning, right? Because we already assigned, we already have a value for first and second. We're calling the function here, and we already have values for first and second, so it's okay to write first and second because those are going to be the values from the text box, right? By the way, he also says that if second, when you write second here, if Visual Studio puts these two brackets around it over here, then just delete those brackets because it's not supposed to. That's not what we're trying to do. So this is okay to put first and second because this is being called up here, right? Here. It's not written like that here, but we're going to call it here. And these are going to have values, so we can put in as arguments first and second. Like that. Okay, now he says run your program and check that it's working properly. Now that you have changed the calling line, now that you've changed the calling line. When you're done, change the variable names for your add sub to this. So if you change the code like this, so all we did was we changed this to, instead of to first, we called it first 2. Instead of second, we called this second 2. It's not going to make any difference in the way the code works. These are just sort of there as names that we can then refer to them later on the code. So then we have to change, of course, this to first 2 because we want to take this, what the user supplies here, plus what the user supplies here, and add them to get answers. So if we're telling our code that what the user supplies here is going to be called first 2, then we have to say take first 2 and take second 2 to get the answer. But then it'll still work. So he says here we change the names in our sub. The variable names are now different from the ones in the calling line. The variable names means the parameter names. They are now first 2 and second 2. But will it work? Test your program out and check it. You should find that it works. Then he says to sum up, we can use a sub to create our own code segment. We use the sub just by referring to it by name, and then if we want to pass any values to our sub, we can set up parameters in between the parentheses. By the way, he calls, okay. Alright, that's okay, let's stop here and then we'll go on to the next, which is the difference between by val and by ref. Now we have talked about it before, but let's talk about it again.